Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to Macdonald-Laurier Institute's webinar, Indigenous Engagement with the Canadian Energy Economy, How Far We've Come. Delighted to have you with us today. My name is Ken Coates. I'm a senior fellow with the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. For those of you who don't know much about Emily, Macdonald-Laurier Institute is a think tank based in Ottawa, devoted to the study of national policy. We have been working for the last 7 years on a major project relating to Indigenous participation in the natural resource economy. Our latest project, the one we're currently working on, is Indigenous people in the oil and gas industry. We've got people coming and joining us from coast to coast to coast. We're delighted to have folks with us from Eastern Canada to the far north and out here in British Columbia, where I'm sitting right now. Because we're across all of Canada and actually international, we are coming to you from different Indigenous lands, and it's wonderful to be able to recognize the First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people whose ancestors have walked on this land for thousands of years. And we appreciate greatly their willingness to share the land and its resources with all of us. We've got a wonderful sort of panel set up for you today. I think you're going to enjoy it greatly. This webinar will run from 7 o'clock British Columbia time, at 10 o'clock out in Ontario, and 11 o'clock in the Maritimes, and run from for an hour and a half. We'll be finished at 11:30 Eastern time. The format is we have 3 speakers, each of whom will give a quick opening comment. We will then have a series of moderators' questions. I will direct questions at the individual speakers, and they'll be asked to address them. We've been collecting audience questions over the last couple of days, and we welcome anybody on the webinar to please add your questions to the list. We probably won't be able to get to all of them, but we will certainly have set aside time to ask the questions that people have raised already, or the ones they want to raise as a part of this conversation sort of goes forward. So let me introduce our 3 speakers first. I think you've probably seen in the webinar material their background, so I won't go on at great length. But we're very, very fortunate to have 3 superb and very knowledgeable individuals with us today. Stephen Buffalo is the President and Chief Executive Officer of the Indian Resource Council. He is one of the leading spokespeople in the country on Indigenous engagement in the natural resource economy, the oil and gas industry specifically. He's from the Samson Cree First Nation. He's a graduate from the University of Lethbridge. And before he joined RRC, he spent many years with the PCL Trust, has a wonderful reputation as a business leader and an advocate for Indigenous rights. Heather Exner-Perot is the research advisor for the Indian Resource Network. She's a senior consultant with Morris Interactive. She holds a PhD from the University of Calgary, worked previously at the University of Saskatchewan. And in addition to her work on Indigenous involvement in the resource economy, is one of Canada's best-known Arctic specialists and does a whole bunch of work on circumpolar affairs. JP Gladeau, we're pleased to say, has taken a break from fishing, hopefully only for a little while today. He is the president of the Alberta to Alaska Railway. He's a chief development officer and relationship officer for Steel River Group. He's the former president, many of you will know him in this capacity, the former president and CEO of the Canadian Council of Aboriginal Business, which propelled JP to international prominence as one of the leading spokespeople on Indigenous entrepreneurialism and business development in Canada. As a small sidelight, he also spent 3 years as the Chancellor of St. Paul's University College at the University of Waterloo. These are 3 of the best people in the country to speak on the topics that we have before us, and I welcome them, all 3 of them, to this very important presentation. So we're going to go in this order. I'm going to ask JP to go first, and then Heather, and then Stephen. When that is finished, we'll have moderated questions, and then questions from the audience. So JP, over to you, please. Your introductory comments.
Great. Thank you so much, Ken. Really appreciate the opportunity to be with you today from across the country, and as well as my friends Heather and Stephen, who I have a lot of respect for. Yes, Ken, I'm looking out at the lake right now going, I would like to be fishing, but this is also a great opportunity for ourselves to communicate to Canada and the world about the importance of balancing because I think a lot of that, the comments and what you're going to hear from everybody in this panel and myself, the importance of balancing our natural connection to the land and resource development. You know, when we talk about the title of this, How Far We've Come, I think that's absolutely the perfect title for this conversation. Just a little bit about my history. You know, I sit here on my community, Sandpoint First Nation, and my grandfather was a logger, my dad was a logger. My other grandfather helped build the Trans-Canada gas pipeline, which is literally goes through my reserve here. And I was so fortunate that both my grandfathers had employment opportunities, which modeled to my parents' job and work ethic. And, you know, a lot of our communities, a lot of our youth often don't have that modeling, unfortunately, due to a lot of the colonialistic practices that happened. And what that has done for me is that both my parents had jobs, and they were based on the natural resource sector. And, you know, I was the very first person in my family history to go beyond high school. And now I'm in this wonderful position where I get with others and to advocate for the inclusion of Indigenous people in all parts of our economy. And I take this role very seriously because I know firsthand what jobs and business can do for our communities and people like myself. And so I've had this extraordinary opportunity, and it's a real privilege to be here. When we think about the history in this country, we were pretty much relegated to our reserves. We weren't allowed to leave without the permission of the Indian agents, to a place where when we got to break through those barriers, we started to get some jobs. You know, I explained a couple of them already, my grandfathers had. And then all of a sudden there's this resurgence of Indigenous entrepreneurs. And I say resurgence because we are Canada's first entrepreneurs. And that resurgence takes the form in, you know, 50,000 Indigenous businesses plus across the country, competing in every sector. And now how far we've come. Look at the way that we're proliferating now in a place where we're becoming partners and equity partners in major infrastructure projects across the country, and becoming meaningful partners, because at the end of the day, we can't rely on government, and nor has that ever been a good feeling, I would imagine, for most of us, to rely on somebody else for our well-being. And so being able to participate at all levels of a supply chain or employment, from the frontline workers to the executives like the Mel Bensons who sit on the board of Suncor, is extraordinary. The oil and gas sector is one that I truly support. When it's done right, when it's done with our people, it's a great opportunity. But we also have these challenges in our country where not all of us, we're Indigenous people, we're not homogenous. There are communities and people that don't support sectors like the oil and gas sector. But unfortunately, a lot of the media portrays all of us with one color, that we're opposed to resource development. And that's the furthest thing from the truth. Many of our communities are supportive of these resource development projects. So now is the opportunity to start telling these types of stories about how important it is to our communities and starting to tell the whole story. You know, I believe that, you know, the oil and gas companies, and I've heard this in the stage before, and I love this saying, is that oil and gas companies, I'm sure their first thought is when they get up in the morning, how are we going to destroy the environment? That's not what they're about. And I think that, you know, the environmental groups as well, I'm sure and I hope that their first thoughts aren't how are we going to destroy the economy and jobs. So what's that place where we can actually proliferate together through responsible, sustainable development with the best technology and with Indigenous people at the table, from the inception of an idea to construction to decommissioning, reclamation, and so forth. So this is a real opportunity for our country to get it right. And I'm excited about the future. So I'll pause here.
Oh, excellent, JP. Thank you very much. That's a great way to sort of get us started. And Heather, I'll ask you to go next, please.
Great. Yeah, well, thanks so much for having me. It's obviously my great privilege to be here with Stephen, who I worked with a little bit with the Indian Resource Council, and JP, who I work with the Indigenous Resource Network. And of course, Ken, people wouldn't know, but my first research assistant position was 15 years with Ken. So we have a long history also. And I've done most of my research, Ken mentioned a little bit, but the things I'm most passionate about, I guess, are Indigenous economic development and Indigenous governance. And I've also done some work on health and education, some other things. But the solution to all the problems that you might get in those sectors of educational attainment or housing or addictions or trauma or abuse, it always comes down to the economy and having opportunities and a livelihood, and for communities to have their own source revenue so they don't have to depend on the government. So Stephen and JP can speak. Yeah, Alison, you can start the slide. Stephen and JP will always speak very eloquently about what it means for communities and for them and the people they know. And my role here is much more, this is the last slide, Alison, if you want to start from the beginning, is to really to provide some of the numbers of why Indigenous communities do want to be engaged, the majority in resource development, and why, if we want collectively to see better Indigenous economic development, that we should be providing these opportunities. So I'll just run quickly through this. Indigenous businesses, this comes from CCAB data and Statistics Canada data, are 40 times more likely to be involved in resource development than the average Canadian business. And so, and we'll talk, I think, with the questions about why that's so, but there's so many more opportunities, and the location and the geography and everything has just meant that there's, this is where the money and the contracts and the opportunities and the entrepreneurship has revolved. And so it's a fundamentally important aspect of the Indigenous economy. People don't think of Indigenous people, First Nations, having their own oil and gas businesses. And Stephen, this is Indian Resource Council data. But actually, there's 38 oil and gas producing reserves right now, and 108 actually have agreements with oil and gas companies to have that potential if the business case was ever good. In the last 10 years, First Nations have collected over $1 billion in royalties from that oil and gas production on reserve. So that's a tremendous amount of own source revenues. That means they don't have to be as dependent on the federal government, which is how you achieve self-determination. And that's just what they produce on reserve. It's very hard with impact and benefit agreements and mutual benefit agreements to know exactly how much money is being passed in contracts and procurement and for pipelines. But for example, with TMX, they publicly stated that they have 58 agreements worth over $500 million. And of course, there's thousands and thousands of kilometers of pipeline in the country, and many First Nations get some financial benefit from that. So it's you can't compare these numbers to, for example, tourism or even fishing. They're just much higher. Next slide, Alison. So the own source revenues are hugely important for communities, for nations, to be able to be, self-determining, financially independent. But oil and gas is also the best payer of wages to Indigenous people. So if anyone's ever familiar with Statistics Canada, how they look at industry classifications, NAICS is the North American Industry Classification System. It's a very standard system. There's a couple hundred occupations that they assess. This is all 2015 census data. But of the highest 10 occupations for Indigenous people, 8 of the 10 are oil and gas and mining. So again, and the lowest 10 you see are in restaurants, clothing, service-oriented jobs. Unfortunately, hunting and trapping was the lowest paid occupation for Indigenous people. So just to see that, it's a significantly more opportunity for Indigenous people to support their families and have a good life in oil and gas occupations. Next slide, Alison. And of course, it's very important to keep track of how Indigenous women are doing. For Indigenous women, oil and gas are the top 4 highest paying occupations. That's pipeline transportation, oil and gas, chemical manufacturing, which usually comes from natural gas, and distribution. And these jobs are 3 or 4 times higher paying than the average job that an Indigenous woman has access to in Canada. These are the kinds of jobs that a single Indigenous woman can buy a house with, go to Disneyland with her kids with, send her kids to university or to hockey camps. These kinds of living wages make a real difference. So we should be expanding these opportunities. Next slide, Alison. So how many are they employing? It's in the number of a couple thousand. So about 12,000 Indigenous people work in the oil and gas sector, according to Stats Canada. But the proportion is also much higher than the average industry. So the extractive sector, that includes mining and quarrying and oil and gas, the proportion that identify on the census as Aboriginal is about 7.8%. So that's double the total average of all sectors, and it's also significantly higher than the federal public service, just as a comparator. And having come from a university, I can tell you, it's an order of magnitude higher than the Indigenous representation in university administrations. Allison, next slide. And then, of course, procurement. And, the work that I've done, I can tell you that the very best kind of fiscal access or financial development comes from businesses. So it's great to get royalties, they're resource rents. There's some issues with resource rents typically in kind of the development literature. Wages are great, but again, that's still labor. And so the very best way that you can create good economic development circumstances in Indigenous communities is to increase entrepreneurship and businesses. And so for me, the procurement is probably the most important factor in why the oil and gas sector is so important to Indigenous communities. They spend billions every year, and that's just in the oil sands. There's more off oil sands also on Indigenous businesses. And as a comparison, the federal government, through their procurement, their Aboriginal procurement program, PSAB, according to their own numbers, they spent $3.3 billion since 1996. And that accounts for less than 1%, a third of 1% of their annual federal procurement spending. And thanks to JP's good work, they've now committed to try to take it out up to 5%. And it'll take some time for them to get there, but that's a wonderful target. And I think it's very important. I think that's a great commitment. By comparison, Suncor has spent $5 billion since 1999. So we're talking about one company that has outspent the entire federal government by a significant chunk. And last year was $700 million. That's 8% of their spending. So the federal government has to increase their spending by, 20, 25 times to catch up to that one company. And Cenovus, I only said Suncor and Cenovus because they publicly declare how much they spent. It's easily accessible. Since they started in December 2009, it's 2.8. I know other companies like Cameco have also spent in the billions of dollars on Indigenous procurement in the last decade or two. That's why the opportunities, that's why 40 times more Indigenous companies are in the resource development sector, because the opportunities are so much better. And then last slide here, Allison. So just from my perspective, to understand where I come from, if you think it's very important to have Indigenous economic development, if you think that you require economic self-determination to have political self-determination, I don't think there's a pathway to get that in Canada for Indigenous communities without being fully involved in resource development. And I don't think the math works. There's no other sector that can really compete, that comes even as close to contributing to Indigenous prosperity in terms of, like I said, the jobs, the wages, the own source revenues for communities, and also the business development. And that's why I'm always looking to support Indigenous communities to enter into these agreements, never be forced, but to enter into agreements that are mutually beneficial and to promote a context and environment where this can happen. So I'll stop there, Ken.
Heather, thank you very much. That's wonderful context and great detail and information on the background to all of this. We're talking here about lives. We're talking about community well-being. We're talking about economic opportunity. And I really like the comment that both you and JP have made about the fact that an awful lot of this effort is really about autonomy. It's about giving First Nations the capacity to run their own affairs and determine their own future, and to develop sort of a greater separation from the welfare dependency that, quite frankly, has locked up First Nations, Indigenous communities for the last century or more. Stephen, it's your turn. Love to hear your comments.
Okay. First of all, I want to thank the creator for today. I want to thank my fellow colleagues and Ken, Heather, and JP for this tremendous opportunity. I'm humbled to be asked by Macdonald-Laurier Institute to be a part of this. As mentioned, I'm from Musquecheese, Samson, and I grew up seeing oil and gas all around me. And to be honest, a lot of our people didn't understand the industry. So being involved with the Indian Resource Council and advocating on behalf of that industry and our form of secondary income to our community is paramount. And yeah, we've seen some good years of royalty, but we didn't know much about the industry and the social problems that come with that type of injection of money to peoples that shouldn't have had managed that type of money. We've made changes, but we've gone through a lot of social issues with that wealth. but we found a balance. The Indian Resource Council continues to advocate for our communities that are producing and potentially producing, and a couple of initiatives we're working on is actually taking over jurisdiction of and replacing Indian Oil and Gas Canada. And I think that's imperative. We talk about our own rights and our own destinies as to how we want to see progression in this industry, and we've learned a lot. We've learned the good stuff, and we've definitely learned the ugly stuff with industry, especially when oil was $120 a barrel. We were more or less run over by industry and government, and lo and behold, our industry fell to almost a negative, couple days in the negative as price per barrel. But the silver lining is that when we hit the ground together, and we realized we need to work together. We can't settle things in court. Nobody wins. And I'd like to acknowledge a group I'm with, the Canadian Energy Executive Association, AKA the Oilmen, for their initiative to bridge that gap with First Nations and industry. And I think that's right now one of the positive steps that we can do in this downturn. And we look at each other and we say, well, how can we do things better? And it's our responsibility, the communities, to really start preparing ourselves, improving our governance, our corporate governance, and be prepared for this industry. And hopefully our youth can be a part of this. And the repatriation is the big movement right now. We have some orphan abandoned wells. The federal government has announced a site rehabilitation program. Here in Alberta, we got $1.7 billion. People think that's a lot of money. But when you look at all the wells here in Alberta, and if we need to fix the land, and from where I come from, that's the wish of the elders, is that please fix the land, take care of the pipes, get them onto the ground. And this program is imperative that we utilize it and we participate, not only for economic development, but primarily to clean the land. So we must continue to work together. I resonate some of JP's comments and Heather's comments in regards to this is a source and an industry that has been very good to our people. But when you look at the slide where Heather had 1.2 billion over 10 years, people might think that's a lot of money. And quite honestly, it isn't. At one time we had 143 First Nations producing, and our shareholders and our shareholders' needs are different as to a mainstream industry. We have housing issues, we have water issues. We're trying to retain our culture and our language, and the only way you can deal with social problems like that is if you have a healthy economy. So yeah, we've seen some money come in. And we've built our own infrastructures in some capacities. We've built our own schools. We address some of the water issues, and we try to address a lot of the social issues that First Nations face with this industry, with revenue from this industry. But we still need to do better. And again, having this opportunity to discuss some of the things that are imperative. Our country is making a clear statement, with things that are happening at the federal level. And we have to adjust, and we just have to be prepared. Oil and gas is definitely been very good for First Nations, and there's a movement for the cleaner energy and the greener energy, and we want to strive to that place too. But from what I can see, it's going to take some time. We still rely on energy in all capacities, and the benefits from oil and gas that we take for granted, our roads, the chemicals and everything that we utilize in our everyday life that stems from oil and gas. We have to continue to develop this resource in a very responsible way, and start looking at this down the road as some of the downstream projects. We're looking at investments. We need to take our place. We need to find a way to eliminate the Indian Act. In my view, It's a form of soft communism. I honestly think that when chief and council get a budget from the federal government, it's basically managing poverty, and it's a system that does not work and it will not continue to work unless we make the changes ourselves. And I think this natural resource sector is the way to do it. That they get started on making that transition. That's all I have for now. And I'd again thank everyone for joining us today, and hope we have some good discussion. Thank you.
With all of these great comments, Stephen, we'll have a great discussion, I'm sure. And I remember you talking about this many times over the years, that the issue that's in front of us, which is great in many ways, is this question of managing prosperity. You described just a second ago of saying the challenge was managing poverty. And managing poverty pandemic across the country, that our system is set up to make First Nations in particular manage their own despair, which is always disappointing. Now you've got a situation where communities are wrestling with this question of managing prosperity. It's not easy.
No.
And you've been there at these meetings where people are having to decide between, do we reinvest in business, do we reinvest in community infrastructure, or do we divide up the money and give it to each member so they get a small $5,000 a year allocation? These are not decisions that everybody else has to make in this country.
No.
But they're actually really critical ones, aren't they?
Well, very much so. We've lived through it. Samson has lived through that, and quite honestly, I'm glad we stopped it when we did. We've created a heritage trust fund and put the remaining royalties we had left, and it started at $350 million, and we've invested it wisely with 5 different firms, and now the fund is around $560 million. So that says a lot, and we utilize the interest revenue obviously to help back with the community and some of the projects and programs that we have developed in our own way. But same as anything, when you make more money, you spend more money. So you try to cover all the bases. But ultimately, I think that's the trend of First Nations, is to maintain any capital that they can possibly get and utilize it for future generations and not to deplete the fund completely. It's very tough decisions for leaderships nowadays. Again, like you said, Ken, I really do not like how the funding comes from the federal government and the restrictions that it has on us. Even the act itself in towards economic development is very challenging. But we seem to always find a way. When it makes sense for industry and it makes sense for provincial government, I think the federal government kind of sees it that way. And of course, at headquarters at Indian Affairs, they're assisting us in asserting our own jurisdiction with this transition of turning the Indian Resource Council into the institution it needed to be, not necessarily regulators, but really to manage our own lands and resources. And really, that's us, up to us now to embrace that and to push it so that we can decide for ourselves on how things should go forward from here on in. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you, Stephen. So I've got a series of moderators questions that leaves me in complete charge of my 3 friends and get to ask them all sorts of tough questions and to see if I can trip them up. Actually, just to sort of build on their wonderful presentation so far and see where we go. So, JP, I wonder if I'll start with you. You mentioned before about the fact that, and Heather gave us wonderful data on sort of how extensive Indigenous entrepreneurship is and Indigenous engagement is at present. So what is stopping Indigenous folks from being more involved? So you got a magic wand in your hand and you can talk to the Prime Minister and the Cabinet and say, here's what we have to fix in order to make sure Indigenous people participate more aggressively, more comprehensively. What do they have to do? So JP, what's your plan? What's the suggestions of what we have to do?
Well, interestingly, as you were talking, you started to break up, so I missed part of it, which kind of leads to me, one of the most important things is having adequate infrastructure in our communities. Because if we don't have the adequate infrastructure to support our families, to be able to raise our kids so that they can be fully productive human beings, I think we're going to be losing out on a certain level of capacity, because our youth are our future. I think some of the biggest barriers to our Indigenous entrepreneurs and our communities is getting access to capital. without capital, it's very difficult to invest or attract investment into your projects, into your work. And then I guess lastly, from a pure feeling proud as a person, I think we need to be celebrating more about who we are. And I don't mean that just only in our own communities. I mean, like for instance, Kenny, you and I have had this conversation other times, and why I take my role so seriously as the Chancellor of St. Paul's Waterloo University College is that when we're training our people, we need to see ourselves in the faces of success. And we need Canadians to also see ourselves as successful individuals in the Canadian economy, because I think one of the biggest challenges is just the ignorance that exists in this country. And we still battle racism every day. And the only way we break down those is through handshakes and business deals and being in the trenches together, not only as community to community, but also community with industry. And I think, some of the long-standing relationships, like the previous Chief Boucher, and I know the Chief Grandjam is carrying on that legacy of progressive relationships with industry, putting aside our differences and finding the commonalities where we can actually work and proliferate together in the economy. I can tell you, I'm so lucky, and I think Stephen would agree with me, is that we're standing on the shoulders of some pretty big giants like the Jim Bouchers of the world and the Phil Fontaines, etc. But when we look behind us and with us, there's such a strong cohort of Indigenous entrepreneurs and business people and educated people that are just going to be catapulting us ahead. And we've got to be able to support that next segment of our population that are coming up into leadership positions.
Thanks, JP. That's a pretty broad prescription of what has to be done. And it's really important to sort of start with the questions about infrastructure. I think people would still be shocked to discover the gap between what happens on most First Nation reserves, even ones that are relatively close to sort of large centers. This is not just a problem for the far north of Ontario or the far north of Manitoba. This is sometimes a problem for reserves that are 50 kilometers away from Red Deer. And I don't think we have anywhere near enough awareness and public conversation sort of about that. So let me put Heather on the spot. This is a really interesting question. Some people who are some of our audience members have asked questions about this matter of regulation or over-regulation or the development of new assessment processes and procedures. So Heather, as you well know, you've written and talked about this a lot. Bill C-69 brought in a bunch of new sort of regulations about how decisions will be made in the oil and gas sector and resource development sector generally. And UNDRIP, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, is likewise bringing in some very new, potentially bringing in some very new processes. What's the feeling among Indigenous communities and the folks that you work with about these new regulatory measures? I know that's why I'm asking you instead of Stephen, that Stephen published some very cautionary words about both of these documents, and Stephen, not to just to paraphrase what you said in those other writings, it was basically be cautious. Don't throw out these new regulations without understanding the implications, and you may be stopping the sort of the walk toward prosperity without even doing it on purpose. And you think you're helping the communities, you could be hurting them. So that's my sense of Stephen's observations. Heather, I'd like your thoughts.
Yeah, and I hope we have another UNDRIP or FPIC question after that I'm very interested in talking about, but I'm going to focus on the business environment for doing business on Indigenous territories, which I think is what you're getting at. And with Bill C-69, I think we very much saw a sense coming out of Ottawa that they need to protect Indigenous communities from industry. And so they are inserting more regulations and making it harder and having more processes so that kind of big bet industry can't exploit poor Indigenous communities. And I think that mentality is, has been with us for a long time. The road to hell is paved with the good intentions. And so right now, if you want to do business on reserve and you're under the Indian Act and, for example, don't have your own land code or land claims agreement, it is incredibly restrictive. in the way that you can do business, in the way that you can use your own land, in the way that you can develop economically. And many First Nations are looking at ways to get rid of parts of the Indian Act, develop different legislation. They don't have to abide under that context. I think things like Bill C-69 and potentially with UNDRIP, but I want to have a more fulsome conversation about that because there's lots of mixed feelings on UNDRIP, also have the potential to make investment on Indigenous territories very unattractive. And we're already seeing some capital flight. And I think people need to think very carefully. If you want to have an Indigenous economy, if you want them to be part of resource sector, don't make it harder for businesses to do work on Indigenous territory than it is everywhere else, and that's what's happening. And it's hard to say, when oil and gas, people are, once bitten, twice shy, and I think there's reluctance, because of TMX or because of CGL, to venture into such a big project again. But in terms of the actual numbers, after C-69 was passed last year, I think it's the Fraser Institute does an annual survey of mining attractiveness. So I think this is a good proxy for oil and gas. And it used to be that 3 or 4 Canadian jurisdictions, Saskatchewan, Northwest Territories, Yukon, Quebec would be in the top 10 most attractive jurisdictions for mining investment. And every Canadian jurisdiction, I think, fell out of the top 10 this year, and every single one dropped. And the rocks are exactly the same. The mineral potential is exactly the same, but the willingness of investors to come to Canada has dropped. And I want people to think about what are the implications for that if we don't have if you come to the conclusion, as I have after 15 years, that the best pathway for economic self-determination is through natural resource industries, that really there is no other pathway, then you better be very careful about setting up a regulatory system that does not attract that wants to make that harder, more expensive for investors who can move their capital elsewhere. But Indigenous communities can't move their lands.
Thanks, Heather. It is really hard to get Ottawa to sort of change its view that its role is to protect Indigenous folks. And when you work with folks like JP and Stephen and all their colleagues in the industry, you realize that they don't need protection. These are smart, talented people who know what their communities want and what they need. It's a very, very different world. JP, I'm wondering if I can get you to answer a question for me. And then I'm going to turn to a bunch of questions that have been asked by our audience members. There's a standard dichotomy that's presented between the environment or oil and gas development, as though it's sort of an either or proposition, that if you're in favor of oil and gas, by definition, you're opposed to protecting the environment. And if you're in favor of protecting the environment, by definition, you must be opposed to oil and gas development. And if you look at the media coverage and the commentary generally, it sort of runs along the line that Indigenous people generally are opposed to oil and gas. They're in favor of environmental protection. Can you walk us through that a little bit, JP, and sort of talk about that search for a balance between resource development and oil and gas development and environmental protection?
Oh dear. Yeah, you cut out. Sorry, Ken. Can you just repeat that last little bit? I missed it.
Just wondering about the balance between environmental protection and resource development, and how do Indigenous people sort of square that tension?
Yeah, for sure. And it goes back to my comments, I think, around, people don't get up in the morning, how are we going to destroy the environment, and others don't get up in the morning and go, how are we going to destroy the economies? What I love about empowering Indigenous communities to help create that balance between, responsible development and protection is that we're Mother Earth, we're its original guardians. We understand our people have been on the land for thousands of years. But at the same time, as everybody's been listening to the great comments from both you, Heather, and Stephen, as well as the guidance of Ken, is that we also have this aspiration to be healthy, contributing citizens to the economy. We're no longer dependent. So that puts us in a really unique position with our rights. I think it puts us in a unique position as the people that are on the land most of the time to strike that balance. One of my favorite things to do when I was practicing forester was to sit down with elders and pore over the maps about where harvesting of trees could occur and areas that were off limits. and working with government and the forestry companies to map out what that actually looks like on the ground. And when you empower an Indigenous community to be in a place where we're cohorts and making the decisions, we don't become adversaries so much as friends, where we can come to the table to decide together what's responsible development, what that looks like, where we can develop. You know, one of the important cases, I think the country's been watching, many of us has been watching the issues around Formica First Nation and Moose Lake.
I'm afraid
Beautiful
we've
land.
lost.
Formica had no oil sand. Uh-oh. That's too bad. Can you hear me?
You're back on, JP, so just go back over your answer a little bit.
So I'll leave it here. I'll leave with this story. Formica has been a really great partner with the oil and gas sector. You look at the East Tank project with Mikisew, Formica, and Suncor. Formica has been a meaningful partner. But Moose Lake is in question. To me, they want to protect Moose Lake because that's culturally important to them, and from an environmental perspective, that's important to them. So they're the ones striking the balance. They're the ones that are at the table and living in the territory. And the more empowerment if you have Indigenous people in these types of balanced equations, I think the stronger the outcomes are going to be in responsible development and conservation and balancing our environmental needs.
Thanks, JP. Appreciate that, and sorry the infrastructure is letting us down a little bit. Stephen, several times you've mentioned the Indian Oil and Gas Canada, and I think all four of us know this situation very well because you've talked about it in many different situations. But I'm wondering, to make sure everybody on the webinar today understands the significance of what that's all about, can you give us a sort of a 1 minute long description of what Indian Oil and Gas Canada has been and what the Indian Resource Council would like it to become?
Sure. You know, the Indian Oil and Gas Canada was born from the Indian Resource Council. So the federal government in the past had Indian Minerals West and Indian Minerals East. And obviously here in the West, the oil and gas play was booming, you know, since 1940. You know, in our traditional territories with Leduc 1 that was born outside of Enoch, Stony Plain, to where we're at. You know, Samson had the Bonnie Glen field, world-class oil field, which our community was based on. And obviously with all that activity happening, the government ended up creating a different special operating agency called Indian Oil and Gas Canada. And the role of this agency, this arm of the government, arm of Indian Affairs, was to help manage and to be our fiduciary trustee for First Nations. People don't realize, like, when oil and gas is produced on First Nation land, the royalties don't directly come to the First Nation. They actually go to Ottawa. And it's the discretion of the minister as to when First Nations can have access to their own royalties. And that's the hard part. So our community, for example, when my father, Victor Buffalo, was the chief, he went to Ottawa to ask for money, $20 million of our own money from oil and gas produced on our reserve for a housing project. And he was told in a very colorful metaphor to F off, basically. And so with the advice of our elders, we ended up taking this agency to court. And eventually we won our own access to our own royalties and access to our own capital. But, you know, as a fiduciary trustee, you know, the Indian Oil and Gas Canada has a responsibility on our land. And then part of the problem is some of our communities are afraid to let go of that responsibility, that liability, I guess a safety net, where Indian Oil and Gas signs a lease with a company for the First Nation on behalf of the First Nation. So now the government is now responsible for anything that happens within that transaction. And you know, a lot of our oil and gas producing nations have grown up from that. They want to do things themselves. You know, you have two scales of the spectrum here. You have communities that have developed oil and gas companies and have strong joint ventures with different major players in the industry. And on the other end, you got communities that don't have that capacity and just want the highest royalties they can possibly get, and be a passive player in that regard. So we try to work with Indian Oil and Gas Canada. Currently, right now, we're working on modernizing the Indian Oil and Gas Act. It's a long, painstaking work, a lot of legal work. But you know, essentially, what we're hoping to do is to take over that capacity so that First Nations can decide and dictate their own future with their own resources and managing their own lands. It's a transition that needs to happen. But again, you know, as far as the regulatory stuff, we need to work with probably the provincial governments to ensure that, you know, industry and our partners, our companies are following a certain regard to protect the environment. So that's it in the nutshell. I hope I made sense.
That was a great nutshell, Stephen. That's really, really helpful for people to understand, because, you know, the realization that these structures, those structures are 50 years old. And those structures happened at a time where Indigenous folks did not have the entrepreneurial background and experience, where there were, and JP used a word that we don't use often enough, and he talked about racism and discrimination. And JP is such a nice and friendly person that he sort of said it with a smile and just a tint of sadness. But the reality is that discrimination and racism hurt, didn't they? I mean, they really restricted opportunities and determined that Aboriginal people were sort of forced out. And then you see something like Indian Oil and Gas Canada that is continuing to operate a system that is 50 years old, and you think, or 60 years old, surely we can do better than that. So excellent. Stephen, thank you very, very much for that. Heather, I want to ask you a question to sort of turn things in a somewhat different direction. One of the major issues that's going on is we've talked about from the Indigenous side, we've talked about particularly First Nations communities, but also Métis groups who've actually made very major transitions. They've changed their approach, become rediscovered their entrepreneurial roots and things of that sort. But the other side's also changed. The oil and gas companies are not your grandparents' oil and gas companies. They're taking a different approach to working with Indigenous communities and First Nations specifically. So answer two very simple questions for me. What changed? What is different about the oil and gas companies in Canada? And what accounts for this transition? Why are these companies acting in a completely different way than they were even 10 or 15 years ago?
Yeah, so I do have an answer. And for me, I mean, you're the historian, but I think there's one major factor. And that was in 2005, the Supreme Court decision that affirmed that the government has a duty to consult and accommodate. And so this duty to consult has really transformed, I think, the landscape for Indigenous communities dealing with natural resources. And part of that is, you know, in the 5 years, I think before 2005, before 2006, there were 20-some impact and benefit agreements. You know, impact and benefit agreements are the private negotiation between a First Nation or Métis community or Inuit community and an industry actor to outline what will be, you know, kind of usually the employment or the jobs contracts or the royalties or the revenues that happens when you have a resource project. They quadrupled in the 5 years after. And the reason for that is there was now an expectation, which might have been a bonus or a nice thing to do before 2005, an expectation that there will be an impact and benefit agreement. And now that's, you know, it's de facto the way things are. There are going to be mutual benefit or impact and benefit agreements when a resource company does work on Indigenous territory. And that has transformed everything. And that has also what has led to the rise. I think we start to see more Aboriginal economic development corporations in the 90s. Maybe the first started to trickle in the 80s, but really taking off in the 2000s. And a lot of that was because communities set up economic development corporations to deal with the impact and benefit agreements, the jobs and the contracts that they were negotiated and guaranteed. And so that has really changed the whole landscape. The other thing is just, you know, times have changed. I think there's much more recognition, especially in Canada, in the developed world, of needing social license to do projects. There have been a lot of, environmental horror stories in the past 50, 60 years, and no one, it's not acceptable to anyone anymore. And then just the sense of reconciliation. But I also think, whereas 5 or 10 years ago, people were doing it because they had to do it, I think we're finally starting to see a shift where industry is starting to see that it makes good business sense as well as ethical sense to have these good partnerships, that there is a win-win situation that can be obtained if we do this right. And I see JP wants to weigh in here also.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to build on what you're saying, Heather, and this, how far have we come question. And I have to commend the provincial government in Alberta for leading the way with the creation of the Alberta Indigenous Opportunities Corporation and the $1 billion backstop. Because the government understands, I think Premier Kennedy understands, that the more empowered communities are, and this is a lot of the color of our story and our conversation today, the more we can advance our country and our province's interests together. And I think that because they're not doing it from a paternalistic approach, which much of the story of this morning conversation has been in our history, but they're actually putting Indigenous people into the driver's seats. My good friend Alicia Dubois, who's a Métis woman, just been announced as the new CEO for that fund. You look at the board of directors, our good friend who's on the line with us today, Stephen Buffalo, is on that board with other Indigenous leaders. That is what reconciliation, that's what true partnership and trust is built on. And one of my recommendations when I was doing some resiliency task force work was we need the federal government to step up also and create these types of backstops and funds to support Indigenous participation in the economy, particularly in infrastructure. So these are the things that we need to be advancing in our country. We can't be resting on these paternalistic ways, because that's not going to get us to where we want to go.
Excellent, JP. And I love the balance in what you're saying between sort of some very serious barriers. We have to make real changes, but there is so much evidence that things are moving in the right direction, that Indigenous communities are gathering strength and working not just with companies and not just with government, working together. And I keep thinking that one of the most interesting sort of developments we're seeing is the fact that Indigenous communities are starting to invest with each other, starting to collaborate. We'll ask a question later on about TransMountain and the possibilities of Indigenous ownership of TransMountain. But that's a really interesting and dramatic sort of change. So I'm going to turn to some questions that are coming in from our audience. And Lee Harding of the Epoch Times has asked a question that I'm going to direct to you, Stephen, if you don't mind,
Sure.
about sort of the change in culture that's actually happening. And he's asking particularly about the fact that we have more self-determination. There's elements of economic empowerment. Neither of these were very strong 30 years ago. And just very interested, Lee Harding is, in sort of how big a transition is this? And is this widespread? Is it happening on all communities? Is it happening on 1% of communities? Sort of what is actually going on in terms of that cultural shift away from government dependency to sort of economic independence?
Well, you look at it at different forms, and I guess from a ground level standpoint, our people are realizing that we can't be dependent on the handouts that we used to get, and again we spoiled ourselves back when we're receiving high royalties from our oil and gas activity, and there's a generation back home where their hand is still sticking out to say, hey, what about me? Help me out. And but you're seeing a younger generation now make that transition. Unfortunately, we didn't ask to be put on a reserve so big by so big, and housing has become an issue, and we need to find a better way. So a lot of our younger people are leaving the communities to not only educate themselves, but to seek employment in different fashions, and that's tremendous. Because that's going to be the key. The hard part of all of this is, again, at a different level, if you look at it from a different standpoint, our culture is somewhat kind of leaving us a little bit. Obviously with the residential school, our language was impacted. A lot of myself included, I can understand Cree and I can speak Cree, but I'm not as fluent as I should be. And I look at my children, and they're very, very limited to Cree, that little bit that I teach them. And you're seeing that transition where, our language is being affected by what is happening around us. And that's just maybe modernization, and things becoming to the way they are nowadays. But the good thing is that, we still have people willing to teach and to help learn. Our culture and ceremonies, at one time, Musquecheese was like a hub for people to come for spiritual help. Now, this is a different context to see, when people ask about our connection to the land, it comes from our culture and why things are the way they are. Some of the questions and answers that we find is through spirituality. And we want to maintain that. It's still very strong. And I tell the youth all the time that our culture, our spirituality, and our connection to the earth is our secret weapon. And it'll help us. It's helped me to get to where I'm at today, and to understand certain things. And when I look at Western society away from where I came from, I see a lot of the similarities, and then I see ways we can continue to work together and kind of understand. We're no different. First Nations. If I went and punched Ken Coates in the nose today, and he punched me in the nose today, we're gonna bleed red. We're mankind, and we just gotta find a way to work together. Why those divisions came up is beyond me, and it's a different discussion. But if we can continue to accept how things are and how certain aspects are, our cultures will continue to be strong. And it's just being respectful. I don't like using the word racism and all that, but it's prevalent. It's been prevalent for years. And with this industry, we learned the hard way. We've been run over by oil and gas companies for years because we didn't understand, and the government's position didn't help us, who was supposed to protect us. So now is the time to fix all of that. And it's again, like, we hit the ground hard, and now we looked at each other and say, hey, we have to work together, not only for our own people, but for mankind in itself. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Please don't punch me.
Yeah.
So, Heather, a question for you on a very different topic. I wanted you to comment on UNDRIP. You sort of said you wanted to be asked this question, and so Brian Smith has asked the question. Please comment on UNDRIP and the positive and negative effects you see on the industry First Nation partnerships.
Great, thanks, Ken.
UNDRIP. Go ahead, Heather.
Yeah, United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. And there was also some submitted audience questions that asked about UNDRIP and FPIC and vetoes and consent and that kind of thing. And so, stop me when I go on too long because I'm very passionate about the subject. But I'm very disappointed in the state of public discussion on UNDRIP. It's we made it so black and white. One side says Indigenous communities should have a veto on everything, and the other side says Indigenous communities can't have a veto on anything. And we've really reduced UNDRIP, which is an incredible document, to that one sentence: free, prior, and informed consent. I just had to point out that it also mentions economic rights, I think, 7 times, and we never discussed that. But the state of the discussion, I think, there's probably some more conservatives watching out there. But let me tell you that I think there are probably circumstances in which every single Canadian, almost every Canadian, would agree that First Nations should have a veto. For example, relocation. If you were going to relocate a community, that would be a very significant burden on the community, a very significant decision that they should probably have to consent to. Storing nuclear waste on reserve, that's probably a decision where they would have a veto. I think we all agree on that. But then the question is there a veto on everything? If there's a linear project that crosses hundreds of territories, like highways, transmission lines, and of course pipelines, that's the major one, does every community along that route get a veto? And I think the Canadian courts have been clear on this, and they have said no. And if with pipelines, there isn't, pipelines are very safe. There's thousands of kilometers running them. You mentioned I do a lot of work on the Arctic. Lots of northern communities would love to have a natural gas pipeline run to their community so they could get off of diesel. We all have, I have a pipeline underneath my house. We're connected. And so it's hard. I think it would be hard to make the argument that this would have some kind of irrevocable effect on Aboriginal rights that couldn't be mitigated or compensated for. So that's my thoughts on pipelines, especially with TMX, which is a twinning project. And CGL, there's already a natural gas pipeline that goes through Wet'suwet'en territory. It's been there for 40 years. So it's hard to argue that it's going to have these terrible negative effects. A few kilometers from my house, they're building a pipeline across the Bow River. It feeds 60% of Calgary's water source. I don't think anyone thinks it's going to poison 700,000 people. I just think pipelines have better technology. But what the federal government is doing with what was Bill 262, we'll see what legislation they call it coming up, and what BC did with Bill C41 or Bill 41, I think was very simplistic. They basically just said we're going to affirm UNDRIP and didn't put the effort in that legislators are supposed to put in to say, what does this mean? And there's lots of questions it raises, and it doesn't answer any. And we saw that with CGL, which happened I think BC passed legislation in November. And then come January and February, every side is saying, oh, Bill 41 supports our case. So there was no clarity offered. In fact, I think it muddied the waters and made it worse. And I hope the federal government avoids that mistake of introducing legislation that makes it harder to decide, that does not clarify Indigenous rights, but just kind of introduces another wrench. So I definitely think most First Nations, almost every Indigenous person I know supports UNDRIP. I think we just need to be much more responsible in clarifying what does that mean in federal legislation. And I'll just point out that New Zealand has taken that different approach, where they're starting with an action plan instead of legislating, a separate UN political declaration that was never meant to be Canadian law.
Wow, mind Ken if I weigh in here. That was incredibly That was really incredibly thoughtful, Heather. I've never heard you speak to UNDRIP. I learned a few things there. Thank you. If I can just add a little bit more color to it, and I think Canadians need to understand, and this has already been brought up, is that we're not a homogenous people. And I think where we get into some of the challenges around linear projects, like look at what happened to Wet'suwet'en, you have 20 First Nations that are in support of a project. You have one community that has some governance challenges between hereditary and elected. So that hereditary, does that veto the prosperity of 20 other communities that want this project? And I guess to everybody, if we got everybody that was on this webinar today and got everybody into a room and asked them to decide what's best for, say, a pipeline or any kind of project, not everybody's going to agree. And so when we get into veto, my view on veto is it's a little bit of a cop-out, quite frankly. And I said it in a respectful way, but it's too easy to put your hands up and walk away from the table. The hard work, and you alluded to it around the legislation, the hard work has to get done. And just like any relationship, you're going to have your ups and downs, but you got to get off your butt the next morning, get back to the table and figure out your relationship. Right. It's way too easy to say, I give up. This country can't have that. And so when it gets into linear projects, we just got to do the hard work. We got to build the relationships. And I hope the learnings that, from yourself and Stephen and Ken, hopefully I've added some value today, that we've got to think differently and we got to act differently because our country's in trouble.
Yeah. I want to take everyone back to 2016. The IRC, we hosted a pipeline gridlock conference because I had two of my staff members sitting up in Prince George asking that question, eating bad pizza and warm draft beer, saying, why can't we get pipelines built in this country? And so we decided to have this conference. Prior to the conference, I got emails, phone calls, messages to say that I was going to kill the earth with this discussion, that pipelines are killing the earth. And I had every environmental extremist coming at me. And what got me the most was a neighboring community outside of Calgary had two youth send me an email saying I did not have their free informed consent I didn't have their FPIC on having this conference, and let alone having pipelines built in Canada. So to me, that sent a message So we fast forward to now, to not long ago, actually. You know, I did an article with the help of Dr. Coates here on this issue. You know, Chief Willie Littlechild is I consider him one of my dads, one of my fathers. I grew up with idolizing him. He's one of my father's best friends, and I've asked him repeatedly to come and explain this FPIC, and it just never worked out where he's able to come and help. But you know, the fact of the matter is, FPIC is not a veto, and he's explained that to me over and over again. It was to the FPIC was to open the door for First Nations to have an opportunity to take advantage of the investment opportunity that might be in front of them. And like JP said, we have to maybe not like it at the beginning, but you know, the truth of the matter is it's coming in our traditional territory, and if we have an opportunity now to have a stronger say, and once you're an owner, once you're an investment owner, you have way a stronger say as to how the program goes, how the infrastructure may be. You'll have a say on how it's regulated and what have you. So we fast forward to now, and we have two hereditary chiefs stopping a project. Something back in 2016, where these young people were part of this environmental group, were told to use FPIC, and now it's being like used as spear against us. And we definitely need to change that narrative. And I hope that we can kind of find that resolve. And I hope to have the authors of this UNDRIP step forward and say that, you know, that this was not to be a veto, but to open the door for the opportunity for our people. That's all I wanted to share. Thank you.
Wonderful, Stephen. Thank you very much. Thank you for three very, very thoughtful commentaries on one of the most difficult sort of issues that comes before us. And it's kind of interesting. I'll put my own 2 cents in here. And my experience over the last 40 years has been that Canadians generally are very supportive of Indigenous rights until they get them. And so they're very supportive of Indigenous rights in the abstract. And then when some piece of legislation comes along, remember when duty to consult and accommodate came along? Heather talked about this before, and so did Stephen. So 2004, Supreme Court of Canada says, you have to consult and you have to accommodate. There is commentary all across the country. We'll never have resource development happen. We'll never have pipelines built. We'll never have oil and gas happen because now you've empowered the First Nations too much. And what was the answer? Heather, give us the answer. You had a 4 times increase in impact to benefit agreements within 5 years. You know, so in empowering Indigenous people does not stop the Canadian economy. It balances the equation. And it actually gives Indigenous people the right to be at the table in a different sort of way. And done properly, and this I think is Heather's point and JP and Stephen as well, done properly, UNDRIP can actually be a successful tool in writing the balance and sort of creating some sort of equity and equality in the system. Done poorly, which essentially is virtue signaling by saying, hey, we support Indigenous rights, let's throw this out there and see what happens. You end up with something that makes things worse rather than better. So excellent questions. We've had a series of questions from the audience. I'm going to put them all together in one and pick up on Lynn Exner's way that she actually phrased this. And we'll start with JP, and the other two can jump in this as well. JP, in your work on the task force for COVID recovery, and JP is part of a sort of a volunteer group that's looking at how does Canada come out of the COVID pandemic and build its economy. The report recommends a green recovery. How do you see that impacting natural resource development and Indigenous economic development opportunities generally? So if you can talk about that, JP, in the context of the COVID recovery task force, but also for Heather and Stephen after JP, what is the relationship between the green economy and oil and gas? So JP, I'll turn to you first.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks a lot, Lynn, for it. My time in the recovery task force was fantastic. This isn't a zero-sum conversation. This is an either-or conversation. Canada globally is behind when it comes to the green technology environment equation. And the way that I view this and continue to view this is I see this as a supplement to support, well, we're talking oil and gas. how can we reduce our greenhouse gases? Well, I'm a big proponent of nuclear, having sat on Ontario Power Generation's board for 4.5 years. Maybe SMR technology has a place to play in reducing greenhouse gases, or more transmission lines, or a combination wind, solar. I mean, we've got all this technology, but we're not very good at, I think, as a country, at empowering a lot of it. The same thing with our output in our vehicles. That's one of the biggest emitters of greenhouse gases is our cars. What can we do to empower a more of an EV strategy in this country? And again, I don't think it's an either or proposal. I think it's an opportunity to bolster one side of the equation that perhaps hasn't had the same amount of investment. At the same time, we do realize that, and I think the oil and gas companies realize that we're transitioning, and we're going to have to transition. Oil and gas isn't going to be around forever. And I think the more progressive companies like like the Suncors of the world, for instance, are investing in a lot of this. They see the long horizon, but we just can't cut off our oil and gas tomorrow and expect that we're ready for a green economy. And that's why I think this task force is really important, because I think it's preparing us for that transition. And you just can't turn off the switch on one and turn on the other. This is a transition, and we got to be competitive as a country. So I think putting more energy into figuring out that transition is really important.
Thanks, JP. Fantastic. Heather, over to you. Same question. Comment on the advent of the green economy and how that relates to Indigenous involvement in oil and gas.
Yeah, great. I mean, I think, I get very tired of the discourse, because I think we hear 5% on the extreme left and 5% on the extreme right. And most of us in the middle are practical, pragmatic people. And of course, we want a better environment. And of course, we want a good economy. And of course, we want cheap energy, to support people's well-being. And so how do we get that? And I'll disagree with JP when he says that oil and gas, is dying or will be dead. I think people underestimate the number of products that come from oil and gas that aren't about, burning gas in your tank in your car. So the combustion engine may go the way of the dodo, but we'll still be having all these other products, the chemicals, the fertilizers, I think natural gas for a long time, and carbon fiber. And when we talk about renewable energies, the solar, the wind power, those things require at some point some input from oil and gas. And so, I think the oil sands are looking right now at, being kind of the global producer of carbon fiber, which would be a much more dynamic material than steel for a lot of construction, a lot of things. And I think that electric vehicles will depend on, and that will come from bitumen, So there's so many ways that we can diversify our oil and gas to not just be about burning oil. And also carbon capture and storage technology is going to be part of it. The IPC confirms that that's going to have to be part of the transition to a greener economy. And frankly, and I think people know this, the oil and gas industry spends more on R&D for these technologies, out of self-interest and also out of regulatory, obligation than any other industry. And so at some point, we're going to have to come up with some new technologies, and someone's going to have to pay for them and monetize them and commercialize them. And there is no better sector positioned to do this than the energy sector. And so this can't be a leave one sector behind. This has to be how are we going to work with this sector to make sure this happens. And I'll just say one last thing, though. From my perspective, I've done a lot of, work on Russia, for example, Russian politics. There is, I think Canadians are, we should be very much more conscious about our consumption, our use, and we need to decrease that. And I'm in favor of any policy that does that. But global consumption is still going up. And so, the choice here is we can reduce the market share that Canada has. And we know right now that market share is just going to be consumed by Russia and Iran and Venezuela and Saudi Arabia and countries with far worse human rights records. So as long as, let's reduce our own consumption. But as long as there's a market for exports, let's make sure it comes from projects that Canadians, First Nations, and Métis will benefit from, and not ones where authoritarian regimes benefit.
Thanks, Heather. Stephen, to you?
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with Heather 100%. Before I get into the discussion, there's no one should be in poverty or should have issues. With all the natural resources Canada has, we should be able to export everything that we got. and that to me, I think would help with this transition as well. We talk about the Canada's economy. Once we start exporting all of our goods in a good, responsible way, I think we're now prepared for this transition. When we talk about going into the green space, the green energy, our members are definitely cognizant of it, and they want to make that transition. But the fear is, again, the cost. How much is this going to cost, and the investment? And then when you mentioned government subsidy, that just means more taxes for everybody. So the one fear I have is the change in technology and how far we advance. I don't know how many people still have a Generation 1 iPhone. I think we're at 12 or 11 right now. So this tells you how fast things change. And when we look at the technology for the green space, it's got to be able to adapt. So if a community invests, say, $10 million of their own money into a solar farm or a wind farm, you got to make sure that, there's some returns, and then that the technology is not insignificant in 4 years, 3 years. That's the only fear I have about that. But ultimately, of course, First Nations need to do that transition slowly. And some of the research that I've done, it can be done in stages. And of course, we want to get there. And it's having the ability to do that. And yet, for example, if JP changes his house at where he's at in Northern Ontario to solar paneling and wind farm or wind turbine generation, he's got to be able to repair or fix that with the resources that he may have. And when First Nations want to make that transition, they got to be able to afford that and have the resources to accommodate any unexpected problems that may occur with the technology in place. But again, that's an opportunity for job creation as well. And then, of course, we fully support that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We've got lots of very interesting questions coming out from our audience. I've got time for sort of one more question and then a quick summary from each of our panelists. So let's not forget the fact that we're in the middle of a very devastating pandemic. On the one side, the pandemic has made us discover the joys of webinars, which means we can share our ideas quickly and profoundly all across the country, as we're doing this morning. But it's had very, very disruptive. So I'd be really interested in, for all three of you, and we'll start with JP, what essentially has been the impact of COVID on Indigenous peoples in the natural resource sector, particularly oil and gas, and what role is oil and gas going to play in the recovery, the Canadian recovery, which we all are hoping very much will be underway shortly. So JP, to you, what's the impact and what's the role will oil and gas play in the future?
Well, I'm a COVID casualty. I resigned from the CCAB, and a few months later, I was getting ready to go. And I've never been partial Friday the 13th, but Friday, March the 13th, I left CCAB, my OPG board, Toronto, and I was headed to the oil patch to head up the Boucher group, David Nicole Boucher. And 10 days later, due to price of oil and COVID and the uncertainty around all of it, I was released. Dave Nicole and I still remain good friends, but it was a real big hit. And I knew I was going to be able to pivot. I mean, here I am today. But, Dave Nicole had to let go 500 people the following Monday. The Indigenous people have been significantly hit in the natural resource sector. 43% of the Boucher workforce was Indigenous. The recovery is going to be long and slow. So the impacts are very acute within the Indigenous community, as far like you look at a lot of the stats that Heather had put up at the front. And then I guess the opportunities are Indigenous communities are shifting significantly. And our ability to supply PPE equipment, for instance, to save off the pandemic. We've got a lot of talented entrepreneurs that are shifting. I think it's up to the government to live up to in that particular space to be procuring from our Indigenous businesses to help the local economies, as well as to be leaders in the way that we deal with this global pandemic.
Thanks, JP. Heather, to you.
Yeah, I'll just say I think for a lot of Indigenous communities, a lot of blue collar communities, a lot of rural and remote communities, the resource sector has always been important, and they know, the impact for jobs and community prosperity and well-being has been well known. And when unfortunately, it's often a boom and bust industry. So people know when it's a bust that there's more unemployment, there's more addictions, there's more domestic abuse. It's not a good thing when people don't have access to jobs and a livelihood and a sense of being part of something. And I think that's spreading, far and wide today. So I think people are getting a small taste of what most, Indigenous communities have to face every day in terms of unemployment and the impacts that has. And so I think we have to be so pragmatic about doing what we can to create good jobs. And that will be, if you can do the math without in Canada, that including the natural resource industry and the oil and gas industry, then I'd love to see it. But from, all the data and the facts that I've seen, it has to include that. So I think, I've been a supporter of the Task Force for Rural Recovery. They had a great report that came out yesterday, and it did outline, and still trying to get to zero emissions, zero carbon emissions, net emissions by 2050. There are technologies that can help us to reduce climate change while still being a powerhouse in natural resources industry. And so being proud of our natural resources industry, being proud of what people contribute and what they do, and not diminishing that, and investing in a situation where investment is attracted to the Canadian natural resource industry and to doing business on Indigenous territories, I think is key. That's how it's going to have to happen.
Great, thank you very much. Stephen, over to you.
Yeah, with the pandemic, in combination with the Russian-Saudi disagreement, it really affected our price of oil. And of course, the negative impact to First Nations is that the royalties weren't quite there, actually to a negative number, where you saw communities getting approximately $5 million a year down to $4,000 a month in royalties from their production. And of course, like I said before, our communities have different shareholders and they utilize those royalties and monies for different areas within their community infrastructure. And of course, that has an impact. Some of our producing nations, obviously had to shut in a lot of their work. And of course, the economic development and employment in the communities has drastically dropped. And the sad part is that we reached out to the federal government through Minister Miller, the Indigenous Relations in Ottawa, and kind of got a negative response. It seems that during this time, the federal government has helped almost every industry in Canada, even to the First Nations living off reserve, but have reluctantly, they chose not to support and assist the oil and gas producing nations. Again, the perception in Ottawa is that First Nations that produce oil and gas are wealthy and that we don't need any more money and stuff like that. But that's not true at all. We utilize that source of revenue for the lack of funding we get. And it's really difficult because some communities have not seen an increase in the federal funding to accommodate the growth in population. So, this industry is, we've invested heavily into it. We're in a position now where we have better leverage on creating partnerships, working with industry, and that bridge is closing. That gap is closing, and it's very, very positive. You see guys like Brian Schmidt and Michael Binion and people up, Miss Mark Little up at Suncor. They're doing their part to ensure that inclusion, which is positive. You're seeing a government here in Alberta create this Alberta Indigenous Opportunities Corp for communities that don't have capital to invest. You're seeing changes because of this pandemic and things that can be more positive for us. It's just up to us to take advantage and really get things right to make sure we're there. Thanks.
Thanks, Stephen. Excellent, and thanks to all three of you. We've actually reached almost to the end of our time, and we've promised all three speakers a quick opportunity to sort of offer a 1 or 2 minute sort of final summary statement, and we'll just to set you up, go from Stephen, Heather, and then finish up with JP. I'm really glad, Stephen, just in sort of passing this on, that you commented about the loss of revenue coming into these communities, and the idea that the federal government might think that these are wealthy communities. You and I have been in meetings with Chief Roy and a few other people who talked about this very openly. They don't talk about it in terms of money. It's not about $1 million or $2 million. It's 6 houses that are not going to be built this year. It's teachers being laid off. It's canceling the culture program and not being able to start the language program or the field school, or taking young people on the land. These are really solid, practical building blocks of a modern Indigenous community and society. These are not luxuries and frivolities. And it's really important that when you think of those transitions and the impact, that we realize how very significant this is on the lives of the folks. So, Stephen, let me give you your last minute. Off you go.
Okay, thank you. Again, I want to thank the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, Ken, and everyone else in the staff as well. I'm very humbled to be with JP and Heather in this discussion. But, as we move forward, like I said, it's about continuously building that relationship. It's about really trying to not really understand each other's culture, but, just accept it, and that I think, given the times that where we're at, there's a lot of things in play here that can help everyone benefit. And it's again, we have goals, and it's how we get there is communication and continued relationship. And I hope that we can have more discussions in and around this. And when this pandemic's over, hopefully we can all meet face to face. And I'd love to hear more ideas to hear on how we can all get to that space. Finding that balance has always been the challenge. And then it's something that I advocate for. There's economic development and environmental issues, and striving for that balance really takes discussion, not only from First Nations, but government and industry. And as we work together and we depend on our generation that's coming forward, I think we can find it. We're at the end of the day, we all need energy. I'd love to go back to the horse days and building a campfire and living out in the land and teepee, but that's not a reality for everybody, and the truth of the matter is we need energy in all forms, and we can do it responsibly, and it just takes time. It's in moderation, but again, thanks for everyone being on today, and hopefully we'll cross paths. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Stephen. Heather, do you? 1 minute?
Yeah, so just going back to the title of this in your report, how far we've come. I know and everyone knows that the oil industry is not perfect, and that the relationships with Indigenous peoples has not been perfect. But is there a more perfect industry out there? And I've done work with healthcare, I've done work with public administration, I've done health with education, I've done health, at universities. Look at manufacturing, look at tourism, look at the food industry. No one else comes as close to providing the kinds of own source revenues, the kinds of wages, the kind of employment, the kinds of procurement contracts. So they are not perfect, but I think there's a good case to be made that they're the least imperfect industry in Canada in dealing with Indigenous peoples. And I think Indigenous Works, did some research on that too, and found that Western resource companies had the most advanced Indigenous policies and strategies of any sector in the country. So we can obsess about oil and gas's relationship with Indigenous peoples, but I think in good faith, we also have to start look at all the things they've done right, and how should some other industries and other sectors in this country try to compete with that.
Excellent, Heather. Thank you very much. And JP, last word to you, sir.
I really enjoyed this morning's conversations. You guys were brilliant. Thank you so much. I know one of my comments earlier where I think our country is in trouble, and I do believe that if we don't shift a little bit quicker, we're going to lose our global competitive edge. But there's a lot of also great things happening in our country, and there's an upward trajectory, I think, with regards to the Indigenous involvement more holistically and across sectors, particularly in the resource sector and oil and gas. But we can't also forget the things that are working. and I'm like a dog on the bone on this issue, just as an example. When the federal government transferred over, I believe, $1.8 billion to Alberta, Saskatchewan, BC for the oil orphan well cleanups, the federal government has a 5% target. That didn't translate to the policy when they transferred over those dollars to the provinces. And again, Indigenous communities lost out on the opportunity to clean up our resources, clean up the wells, monitor it. Missed opportunity, Canada. Get out of our regular boxes of thinking and take a moment to breathe in Indigenous capacity and culture and people and ask the questions. That was just such a silly mistake, I think, quite frankly, but we can rectify it. So lots of optimism as well, but we've got to shift. Thank you.
Well, it's an excellent, positive, and salutary warning, JP. It's a very good way to end what's been a phenomenal conversation. JP, Stephen, and Heather, you were all fantastic. The staff at Macdonald-Laurier Institute did a wonderful job at bringing us all together. Audience members, thank you very, very much for joining us. This document will be available, recorded and available on our website in time, and I hope you'll share it with other people, because this was a very informative, very thoughtful, very thought-provoking sort of conversation. We appreciate JP, Stephen, Heather. We appreciate your frankness, your honesty, and your integrity. Canada deserves more of all three of you. So thank you very, very much. So with that sort of message, we're signing off and saying good day. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. It's Ken Coates from Macdonald-Laurier Institute.